Hello, and welcome to Unit 1 Notes. Hooray! Let's get to it. So hammered home the philosophy of government. You have an idea of who are some major philosophers that are founders, the people that created our government, um, who they were influenced by. The big ones, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. Maybe a couple of you want to dip into Charles Montesquieu. Um, so what we want to do now is start laying some groundwork for other reasons why we should have government. Um, so it's interesting, Unit 1, Lesson 1. The lesson question is, what were the British colonies in America like in the 1770s? For Europeans coming over here, it arguably was a state of nature, because the clash of cultures between the Native Americans and the Europeans, it did create some problems. But for Europeans coming over here, specifically the British, it arguably was a state of nature. So be thinking about that when you are reading lesson 1. What were the British colonies in America like in the 1770s? The lesson purpose: people living in Britain's American colonies in the 1770s were in many ways quite different from the people living in Europe. The colonists brought British laws and customs to America, but they were developing their own way of life as well. So the terms to understand here: authority, who the founders are; government, an institution. Ooh, an interesting term here: an indentured servant; self-sufficient; and subject. So let's get to it. Why study the British colonies in North America? We begin our study of the United States Constitution by looking back in history. The period is the 1770s. By that time, there had been European colonies established in North America for more than 150 years. Nations that had set up colonies in America included France, Great Britain, the Netherlands, and Spain. Our study will focus on the British colonies. It was these 13 colonies that would become the United States of America. By the 1770s, the British colonies along the eastern coast of North America were well established. The British colonists were subjects of Great Britain. Being a subject in this case means being under the rule of a monarch. In 1770, King George III was the ruler of Great Britain. Our nation did not yet exist. Learning about how the people lived in the British colonies can help us understand why they developed their ideas about government. When we talk about government, we mean the people and institutions with authority to make and enforce the laws and manage disputes about laws. People in the 1770s in the British colonies held certain beliefs about good government that still affect our lives today. How did the American Indians live before the Europeans came? The Europeans were newcomers to North America. Hundreds of different groups of Native Americans had inhabited the continent for thousands of years. Along the eastern seacoast, where the British colonists settled, the native Indian people lived in well-organized tribes. They are known as the Eastern Woodland Tribes. They lived by fishing, hunting, gathering wild plants, and tending small crops of corn. The Eastern tribes maintained loose political ties among themselves. In some cases, entire tribes formed leagues so they could come together to discuss common problems. The best known league was the Iroquois League. The Iroquois League was made up of 5 tribes that lived in what today is the state of New York. Where did the British colonists settle? The British colonies in America occupied a large area of land. The colonies stretched 1,200 miles along the coast of the Atlantic Ocean and ran 200 miles inland. Between the settled area and the Mississippi River lay a vast forested country. Few Europeans explored beyond the area of settlement. The nations of Europe were small in area compared to America. Great Britain was only slightly larger than the colony of New York. Although the land was expansive, there were few people living on it. In 1790, The population of the colonies was almost 4 million, compared with more than 300 million people living in the United States today. How did people in the colonies earn a living? And this is where you're going to find answers to the lesson question specifically, now that you have a background idea about what the colonies are about. Boston, New York, and Philadelphia were the largest cities in the colonies. Each had a population of more than 25,000 people. Most people in cities or towns earned their living by working in professions, trades, crafts, or small factories. Most colonists did not live in cities. They lived in small communities or villages or on farms. 90% of the colonists were farmers. So right away, you have an idea of what people did for a job. They worked in professions like making barrels, shoes, ropes, trading goods, creating crafts, or working in small factories. But a majority of the people were, in fact, farmers, self-sufficient farmers. Boom, baby. Farm size varied from the small 30-acre plot of the poorest New England farmers to giant southern plantations with thousands of acres. 30 acres is not small. Those of you that work on a farm, live on a farm, yeah, you realize 30 acres is pretty significant. But again, people had access to that. And it's that idea of the American dream. You can kind of see it right there. Because people, if they were given an opportunity to work a large piece of land, hey, there's a lot of opportunity here, and they don't want to leave. A typical farm was between 90 and 160 acres. Wow. Not all colonists were independent farmers. Some were hired laborers or craftspeople working on the larger farms. Outside the cities and small communities, people in the colonies lived as far as 10 miles from their nearest neighbor. As a result, they had to develop the knowledge and skills to provide for themselves in order to survive. The people became self-sufficient. Self-sufficient means that people had to provide for their own needs. Not only did the colonists grow their own food, they also wove cloth to make their own clothing. They made their own medicines, built their own homes and barns, and made their furniture and tools. Colonists took the surplus produce from their farms and traded it for goods they could not make. Although families worked independently, they traded among their neighbors and helped each other. Neighbors got together to build houses and barns. People rarely traveled more than 50 miles from their homes. A farm family frequently included a hired laborer or an indentured servant. Indentured servants were men and women who sold their labor in exchange for the cost of the trip from Europe to the colonies. Farm families often relied on the labor of slaves, especially in the South. The typical colonial family in the 1770s worked hard and they had the highest standard of living in the world. The land was fertile and crops grew well. As a result, the colonists had diets rich in protein and tended to be healthier than people in Europe. The colonists were also better educated than most Europeans. In fact, a greater percentage of people in the colonies were able to read and write than in any European nation. The most popular publications, other than the Bible, were newspapers. 4 times as many newspapers were published in the colonies than in France. While most colonists lived fairly well, this was not true of everyone. 1/5 of the population was held in slavery. The slaves were people who were brought as laborers to the colonies from different regions of Africa. Slavery was permitted in all the colonies, North and South. Slavery continued to be practiced until 1865. And I'll tell you in class, there were a few colonies that got rid of slavery before 1865 with the Civil War. So there's that. How are the people living in the colonies different from one another? Most colonists were descended from British or Irish settlers. Therefore, most people in the colonies spoke English. Some colonists did not come from English-speaking countries, however. Settlers also came from France. Pardon me. France, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, Sweden, and other countries. All brought with them their own customs and ideas about government and rights. The colonists also held different religious beliefs. There were many different groups of Protestants. There were also Catholics and Jews. Compared to most European nations of the time, the populations of the colonies were diverse. Ooh, a wonderful, wonderful primary source. In the 1700s, a French colonist who settled in New York wrote a book containing a series of letters from a fictional Pennsylvania farmer to his friend in Great Britain. J. Hector St. John was the pen name St. Jean de Crevecoeur used for his book. The letters describe Crevecoeur's views about life in America. Some section of these letters follow. I'm going to read this to you just simply because this is somebody's thoughts and ideas about the colonies from that time. Behold, sir, a humble American planter addressing you from the farther side of the Atlantic. The English traveler to America is arrived on a new continent, a modern society, different from what he had hitherto seen. It is not composed, as in Europe, of great lords who possess everything and of a herd of people who have nothing. Here are no aristocratical families, higher end of society, no courts, no kings. The rich and the poor are not so far removed from each other as they are in Europe. Some few towns excepted, we are all tillers of the earth. Here we are united by the silken bands of mild government. Love it. The silken bands of mild government, all respecting the laws without dreading their power because they are equitable, fair. Think about that. The silken bands of government. We've learned about the purpose of government, what happens when there is no government, at least theoretically. And here is this one fella who has this perspective of government where he's calling it silken. And if you've never felt silk, it's super smooth. And that is what government was in the colonies. It was there, but there were it was not as like hammered down. The people that were in the colonies, they had acres and acres of land. It mentioned in the book that Great Britain was just a little bit larger than one colony. So there is so much opportunity here that with this opportunity, we also want to balance it with what good government is and what it looks like. And it's definitely silk. We don't want it to be harsh. So back to the letter. Here, the traveler views not the hostile castle and the haughty mansion contrasted with the clay-built hut and miserable cabin, where cattle and men help to keep each other warm and dwell in meanness or humility, smoke and indigence, poverty. The meanest of our log houses is dry and comfortable habitation. Lawyer or merchant are the fairest titles our towns afford. We have no princes for whom we toil, starve, and bleed. We are the most perfect society now existing in the world. Here, man is free, as he ought to be. Can a wretch call England or any other kingdom his country, a country that had no bread for him, whose fields procured him no harvest, who met with nothing but the frowns of the rich, the severity of the laws, with jails and punishments, who own not a single foot of the extensive surface of the planet? No. Urged by a variety of motives, here they came. Everything has tended to regenerate them. New laws, a new mode of living, a new social system. Formerly, they were not outnumbered in any civil lists of their country, except in those of the poor. Here, they rank as citizens. So that letter gives us a really great little insight into what people were looking for in the colonies. One, people came over here for like economic reasons. We'll learn about the people coming over here for religious reasons. But the other thing is, if people are coming over here for economic and cultural opportunities, they also want to create a new perspective on what their government is actually going to look like. And their government is then going to reflect what they want, which is that silken bands of government. We don't want a strong government. We just want to live our life. At least that's what a lot of the colonists are going to be probably thinking. So, why were class differences not important in the colonies? The colonies were not divided into a few rich people and a large mass of poor people, as in most of Europe. In the colonies, there was no royalty and no titled nobility. The difference between wealthy and poor people was less important in colonial society. A poor person could become wealthy by using knowledge, skills, and opportunities. In many cases, a man who was not part of the wealthy class could be elected to a government position. All right, so whose opportunities were limited? This one's fun. Not all people shared the same opportunities to gain wealth or to become leaders. Usually, only adult white males who owned property could vote. So read that as rich white men could vote. In most colonies, a person had to own 50 acres of land to be qualified to vote. So there was a little bit of a barrier to entry. But land was easily available. Therefore, more people in the colonies had the right to vote than in any other country at the time. Okay, Native Americans, African Americans, white men without property, and women were typically not allowed to vote or hold office. Women usually were not allowed to own property. Under the law, married couples were considered one person, and the husband controlled the property. Yikes. So, what rights did the colonists value? Since most colonists were self-sufficient, they valued their freedom highly. The people in the colonies thought that their society was superior to the corrupt societies of Europe. Colonists considered themselves to be virtuous, hardworking, simple people. As subjects of Great Britain, the colonists enjoyed the rights included in the British Constitution. You will learn about these rights in lesson 6. Many colonial governments also protected the rights of colonists. For example, the Massachusetts Body of Liberties of 1641 included the right to trial by jury, free elections, and the right of free men to own property. The state of Pennsylvania guaranteed freedom of belief or conscience. In the years before the American Revolution, the colonists were very sensitive to any attempts by the British government to limit their rights. After the Revolution, Americans were concerned with protecting the rights they had just fought for. Ah, yes, I keep using this F word, the founders. Who are they? Let's get to it. Throughout this text, we refer to a group of people as the founders. The founders were the political leaders of the colonies. They had developed their own ideas about what might be the best kind of government. These ideas were formed from their own experiences and their studies of governments of the past. The founders led the fight to free the American colonies from British rule. The founders helped create the state governments, and their ideas influenced the writing of the Constitution. Some of the founders' names you might recognize include John and Abigail Adams, Benjamin Franklin, my favorite, Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, TJ, Mercy Otis Warren, and G-Dub, George Washington. Aha. And that concludes the lesson for lesson 1, what was life like in the colonies. There's a lot there. One thing that you might want to do is throw a PEX filter in your notes. Think about the politics. They wanted the silken bands of government. They wanted small, limited government. So if you have the purpose of government from John Locke in your brain right now, you will know that John Locke wanted government to just do this: protect my life, protect my liberty, protect my property. And if you think about what life in the colonies were like for a lot of people, it was a new life. They came here, they became farmers, they were able to acquire land. Maybe they were poor in England and didn't really have a lot of land because land in England was limited. They come over here, they get a new opportunity for life, they get opportunities to gain more property, and more importantly, they value their liberty. So when you're looking about influential philosophers on our government, that idea of John Locke is right there. A lot of economic opportunities. Life was different in the cities compared to a majority of colonists living on farms. So the urban and rural split there has a huge impact. Cultural differences. A lot of different religions were coming over to the colonies. Um, some colonies had specific religious requirements, like you couldn't vote if you were not a Protestant or something. But generally, overall, throughout the colonies, they valued religious freedom. And we will see that pop up again when we look at the Bill of Rights after the American Revolution. With that being said, that's lesson one. What was life like in the American colonies in the 1770s? See ya.